Good morning, everybody. My name is Taila Ayay, and I'm the executive director and also an attorney, a parents representation attorney in Snohomish County. I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Neil Weiss, to introduce himself.
Hi, I'm Neil Weiss. I'm also an attorney that primarily does parents representation and one of the attorneys for the F.I.R.S.T legal clinic. And I'll turn it over to Adam next.
Good morning, everyone. Adam Ballout, one of the attorneys at the F.I.R.S.T Legal Clinic. I also work alongside Taila and Neil Weiss. Thank you. On. And Jennifer?
Hey, I'm Jennifer Justice. I'm a parent ally and a graduate of the F.I.R.S.T Legal Clinic.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Dee Alexander, and I am an area administrator actually in the Bellingham office now up in Whatcom County, but I did work in Snohomish County with the F.I.R.S.T Legal Clinic historically.
All right, since Gina's not on, maybe Adam, you can give everybody a brief overview of kind of what F.I.R.S.T Clinic is, what F.I.R.S.T stands for, how we came to be, all that good stuff.
Absolutely. Good morning, everyone. Good morning, Justice Montoya Lewis as well. It is an honor to be with you guys. Our F.I.R.S.T Clinic stands for Family Intervention Response to Stop Trauma. And the trauma that we've identified that we're attempting to stop is the unnecessary separation of infants from their families immediately at the hospital following birth. So this is a medical legal collaborative. Our medical partner is the American Academy of Pediatrics, the Washington chapter. And our really vision and hope for this clinic started alongside Neil Weiss, who in our office would take on private cases as well as publicly appointed dependency cases. So our work really was centered around the 72-hour hearings and feeling that there could have been so much more work done prior to those hearings ever coming to court and missed intervention moments and responses there. So our partnership seeks to receive referrals from local hospitals, from the department itself, from local community agencies, drug and alcohol treatment agencies, other defense attorneys, law enforcement referrals, essentially referrals from the community to try to create an intervention path for these families that involves connecting them to local resources, an attorney to give them some guidance about what's coming and what some of the phrases are that the department are going to be using, an explanation of what some of the services are, and then connecting them to a parent ally, a parent with lived experience. Gina and Jennifer, they're really the heart and soul of our clinic. And so our work is completely in the prevention space. And if we are successful, none of the parents that we work with will see the inside of a dependency courtroom. So our real ultimate goal is to make sure that we're changing the trajectory of the family so that it is not system involved. Later on, we'll talk a little bit about the numbers around the clinic, but I think it's important to know up front that about roughly a third of the families that we work with have come from the system. And so they've had systemic involvement. They've been investigated prior when they were children in the family of origin that they've had. And close to 85% of the families that we work with have no filing and no removal of their infant from their family. And so that's a little background about the F.I.R.S.T Clinic and our origins. I think we'll do a kind of a little bit more deep dive under Neil's talk about some of the other issues there. Thank you.
Thank you, Adam. And then with that, I see that Gina Wassemiller has just joined us, so I'll allow her to introduce herself to the group.
Good morning, everyone. I am Gina Wassemiller, and I am a parent ally with the F.I.R.S.T Legal Clinic. I also contract with the Washington State Office of Public Defense Parent Representation Program as a social service worker. So I'm very familiar with working with families since approximately 2010, and I'm proud to be here. Thank you.
Thank you, Gina. And so, Neil, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Our piece is largely about safety planning. But in order to safety plan, and from our perspective as attorneys, you really can't move forward with safety planning without understanding a few things. One of those things is what the law is. Obviously, this is about 1227 and what the changes to the law are. But to be in a meeting even prior to any filing of a dependency or what we call legal preventative advocacy, you have to understand what the department's ability is to go into court and get the relief they're requesting. And at the same time, the other thing that's vital for safety planning, and especially more critical now with the changes in 1227, is understanding what the assessment of a safety threat is. Because unless you understand risks and threats and how those interplay with each other, you really can't safety plan. You're just kind of guessing and coming up with plans altogether. And so the first thing in terms of the statute of what's important, and I'll just do a quick overview of it because I know that there's probably a lot of talk about that outside of this segment, is the main point 1334-065 subsection 5A. And now with the changes in 1227, there's several things that the court needs to find or consider when it comes to removal of a child at a shelter care hearing. So first off is that reasonable efforts, and I'm going to kind of summarize these. There's some detail that I won't go over, but reasonable efforts have been made to prevent or eliminate the need for removal. There's some circumstances where if there's no parent or if certain laws have been, there's been charges against certain laws, there can be a removal. But the main point of removal is that removal now is necessary to prevent imminent physical harm due to child abuse or neglect. There's also other findings that go along with that, contrary to the welfare of the child to be returned home, that there's a nexus between the physical harm and or the risk of imminent physical harm or threat of imminent physical harm, along with what the allegation is. There's also the consideration of harm of removal, and then there's consideration getting to one of the things that we're talking about very closely is prevention services and what we believe goes along with that, which is safety planning. But to get to those points, the main thing that you have to understand is imminent physical harm. And I think one of the difficulties that we have here in dealing with these questions is that there's lots of definitions flying around out there. And they're all similar. They have similarities about what imminent physical harm is. But as an example, the part of this training is the ABA safety framework, which includes 4 things to look at. The department has something similar that they use, a safety framework or safety assessment that has 5 things that they look at. I have this mouse pad right here, which I really like, and it's a triangle, which is 3 things to look at, I think, because it's 3. And so there's all these different kind of frameworks. And ultimately, what imminent physical harm is, I see a lot of people showing their mouse pad solidarity, is that it's not defined in the statute. And so it's, I think, important to understand how the different parties might define it and the statute itself. The questions are, what does imminent mean? What does evidence of physical harm mean? What does evidence of child abuse or neglect mean? And so what's important to understand is this interplay between risk versus threat. And risk is something that is always there. There's always risk. It's a spectrum. It's that something could happen, and you could have something on the low end, which is very low risk. You could have something on the other end, which is very high risk. But where the issue of imminent physical harm comes into play is that's where's the differentiation between a risk versus a threat. And a threat is that it is imminent. It will happen. And again, using this ABA framework, there's 4 things that's looked at there. 1 is that it's specific. 2 is that it's immediate. 3 is that it's out of control. 4 is that there's severe consequences, and then helping out with the department and what their safety assessment and safety framework looks at is a 5th thing, which is vulnerability of the child, which arguably I think can be tied in with severe consequences or some of the other things. But I think important to understand that the department looks at and assesses those 5 things, and the ABA framework similar but different with those 4 things. And so before going forward to prevention services and safety planning, we've come up with some hypotheticals to play around with the idea of what is a safety risk versus what is crossing the line into safety threat. And I know last time we had a fun survey and a little bit more interaction with that part, and I'm just getting a thumbs up that we could keep doing that. So We'll do that and play around with these. I want people to know there's no right or wrong answers. We'll have a short discussion. I guess maybe not so short since we cut some stuff out, so we have more time. Maybe we'll have a little bit more time to do it. About whether this is a safety threat, these hypotheticals are a safety threat or a safety risk, and where that line is and what could maybe change it if it is a risk to becoming a threat. And so just as an example, before getting to the questions that we talk about, a risk would be that a parent who uses substances would not be able to provide or would be neglectful to their children. And I think that that's a good example because although parents with substance use disorder is something that comes up frequently in the system that we're dealing with, whether it's child welfare or in the dependency system, I think it's an example that we all are familiar with, that there are families out there who have use of substances, whether that's marijuana, alcohol, more illicit narcotics, prescription medications, and they use those, and maybe they're into a substance use disorder frame of mind, but they're not at the point where they're neglecting their children. They're doing that in the point where it's safe. So that by itself would be a risk. But an example that the F.I.R.S.T clinic sees often where it starts to get into the point of a safety threat is a parent who uses substances and because of that use falls asleep with their newborn infant in their arms. That's something we especially see with mothers who are in early recovery, whether it's because of working out methadone dosage or because they're early in their recovery. That's a use of substance there, which is the risk, but it turns over into becoming a threat where, hey, if they're falling asleep and nobody's there to help them and they're going to drop a newborn infant, that could result in severe consequences. So just using that as an example. So the first one that I want to do that's the more interactive one is an example of the child reports to someone, CPS or a counselor, that their parent is physically abusing them. That's it. That's all there is to the example. Child reports physical abuse by their parents. And the question is that a risk versus threat? Also, I think it's important to note, no other evidence that goes along that's corroborating that, just the report from the child. And Laura, I don't know how long we're giving or how
Yeah, give about 10 more seconds here.
All right.
So I got about 10 of you that need to submit an answer. All right, 3, 2, 1, and end.
And back to the reminder before going around, we have about 63%. So pretty close to a 2/3, 1/3 split here. 2/3 saying risk, 1/3 saying threat. And I want to just cover those 4 points of the ABA framework. And department, when you get involved, you could use your 5 if you'd like. But specific, immediate, out of control, and severe consequences and vulnerability of the child. Dee or Jennifer, Dee, do you want to jump in? What are your thoughts about whether this is crossing that threshold of risk versus threat?
Yeah, thanks, Neil. For us, there's not enough information here. We don't know if we have a risk or a threat. I mean, potentially we have a risk if what's been reported to us is accurate, but in our job, we go out and gather information. We would interview the child to get more information about the interaction. We do look at vulnerability of the child. How old is this child? Is there an injury? What were the circumstances around the alleged maltreatment? And so for us, just as it would be a risk. There would have to be a lot more information for us to gather to know if this is an actual threat to the child. And again, if there's injuries or if there's other information that we need to gather about what's going on in the family before we could really know if this is a threat or not.
And Jennifer, I saw you on mute too, so I don't know if you want to supplement that or.
No, I was going to say I completely agree with what Dee stated. It's just not enough information to even come close to crossing the safety threat line, and we would just need to gather a lot more before we could make that determination.
All right, and Any other comments from anyone before I kind of talk about it? Well, and that's part of why this is the example specifically. Well, coincidentally using the same word specifically because it's specific. There's no specificity here. There's no timing or talk about when did this happen, what happened, how often does it happen, was anybody else there? There's no corroborating evidence that there's physical marks, nothing. And so I think that, again, we can acknowledge that there's a risk here. It involves something that could definitely use more investigation and more information. But without any additional specificity, it would be certainly my position that this is not into the realm of being an imminent threat. All right. Next example that we have is a parent is not taking their child to services, specifically birth to 3 services. And I think we can make it even more specific, speech therapy. And when I say not taking them, I mean, they have appointments, they're regularly missed. They've tried to redo it a few times, but it's not happening, and they're not getting them to the speech therapy service for whatever reason. Is that a risk or a threat?
All right, I think most people have their answers in, so I'm going to give it another 5 seconds here. If you haven't clicked risk or threat yet. 4, 3, 2, and 1.
All right. Well, this one's a little bit more on the risk side versus threat side. We got a 90-10 split towards risk. D, Jennifer, thoughts about whether this is risk and threat and why?
Yeah, with the information that has been provided, I agree with the group. It's a risk. We don't have enough information about how the lack of follow through with these appointments, even with a young and vulnerable child, might be a severe impact to them or have a long lasting consequence. We don't know if the behavior of the parents is out of the control and leading to the child not being able to get there. Again, we would just need to have a lot more information to answer the 5 threshold questions about why or how this could be a threat as it stands. And probably even after gathering information in cases like these, those remain risks where parents maybe need some support to engage in those services.
And I guess just from my curiosity, what would push this into becoming the realm of a safety threat? And you could mess with anything you want in the hypothetical to get it there.
I would say if it was medical, if there were medical appointments that were being missed and that could cause severe consequence to the child, maybe possibly life-threatening, or could affect them long-term health-wise, that's when that could go over into a threat. But as far as this, definitely not enough information. Dee, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think if there is a medical situation where speech therapy is correcting something that can have a severe impact to the child, it could potentially lead to a threat. I think, I mean, again, Neil, being creative, like if we knocked on that parent's door and they were incapacitated and we saw that maybe substance abuse was impacting their ability to meet the needs of their child, there might be something there that could lead to a threat. So those would be the situations. If something's going on for the parent and their behaviors are out of control and they can't manage those to mitigate the threat or engage in this service, then there might be something there. But again, we'd have to have a lot more information to really know how to move forward with that to determine risk or safety.
All right. So thanks for that. And this was designed to get to the part of the immediate thing. The immediate element. I'm going to use that because I'm an attorney. It's probably the wrong word, but the immediate factor for threat. And so, yeah, with speech therapy, is there an immediate consequence? And I think you could play around with this just like Dee and Jennifer did. But the thought I have is if this was an appointment instead of for speech therapy, something like the child had special needs and had issues with breathing or feeding, and this was a feeding appointment, And that would then become potentially an immediate risk. I think, interested in others' thoughts, even if it was something like a well child check, if it's not specifically for treating something that could become an imminent risk, you're still playing on that line of whether it's an immediate risk or not. But that's what would take it over if the service was something that could result in an immediate consequence to the child's health and physical well-being. All right, any thoughts, comments on that before moving on to the next hypothetical?
Example, maybe if the child is type 1 diabetic, right?
I think
Maybe
that's
that
perfect.
would be at issue.
Yeah, I think that's a perfect example. They have a follow-up appointment, or maybe not follow-up, but just checking in and moving forward with that. And that could absolutely have immediate consequences if they're not following through with the medical appointments the right way. I think that's a perfect example. I'm seeing a lot of nods along with that too. Go ahead, Jennifer.
We had an example one time where missing chemotherapy appointments could set them back and not be in remission anymore. That was one that was a threat.
And I think we could see, especially for that factor of immediate, how missing a chemotherapy appointment, missing appointment regarding diabetes treatment could really result in immediate consequences versus speech therapy, which is concerning, but there's not an immediate physical consequence that goes along with that. And I think that's something that Dee said it perfectly. It's something that the person could use support. They can use potential case management, case planning, and case services, but it doesn't reach the level of being an imminent safety threat. So the next example we have is a parent who physically disciplines their child and leaves a mark. And I'll make it a little bit more specific. An example that comes up, the parent used a belt and spanked the child with a belt, and that left a bruise from the belt. Is that a risk or a threat? Just to be clear, it's a single incident. We're not talking about a series of those. It's one time. We'll say if the parent admits to it too, the whole thing.
All right, about 10 more seconds. Get those answers in. Risk or threat? 3, 2, 1.
All right, back to our 2/3, 1/3 split around 68% for risk and 32% on threat. So a little bit more controversial than the last one. Dee and Jennifer, thoughts on this, risk versus threat?
I think we need some more information. Where is the location of the bruise? How severe is it? How big is it? How old is this child? I think we would need more information before we could say it was a threat. At this point, it would be a risk while we gather more information to determine the circumstances surrounding the incident. The parents admitting to it. Was it just using excessive corporal punishment? I think we just need to gather before we can make that determination.
Dee, anything to add?
No, I would agree. I mean, I think the age of the child, is this a reoccurring incident? Is this something that's happened before? We would look at, what's going on for the parent when the abuse was happening. And again, just that severe impact was there. How serious is the injury? Is it significant? Is it just punishment that got out of control with context? So those would be the things that we would have to gather to determine if there was a threat. But as it stands, it's a risk.
All right, well, so that was kind of the point here. One of them for this one was getting to the threshold of out of control. There's some of the other parts of the framework that comes up. Specific. Well, this is specific. We're talking about a specific incident of what happened. Immediate. Yes, it was immediate. We're talking about something that left a mark on a child and would be beyond certainly state statutes, presumably, about what's okay for corporal discipline. Is there severe consequences? Again, I think leaving a bruise. But the question here for me is out of control. This parent, we're talking about a single time. Is this a parent who you could have a conversation with and say, hey, this is not an acceptable form of physical discipline. Maybe this is how they were raised. And then they are able to acknowledge and say that that wasn't, hey, that's how I learned. This is how I was raised, but now I understand I'm not supposed to do this. And they're completely in control. Also, we could push the hypothetical where they're completely out of control and they have issues regarding their impulsivity or the management of their anger. And those are things that need to be addressed and could push this into a safety threat. I did see a question from Judge Halpert. I want to go back to that one, but before I do that, any other final thoughts on this hypothetical? All right. Question from Judge Halpert was unclear for the example of the speech therapy situation. The parent continues to miss speech therapy appointments, even with supports. Has risk been established? And I think one of the first things is to differentiate between risk versus threat. So I think unquestionably a risk has been established, that there's a risk that the child could be, harmed by not making the appointments that are there. The question is when does it become a safety threat? And I guess that's a question that I'll, because it's a hard one. So I'm going to defer it to D. At what point, if they're chronically missing appointments, would you say that that would become a safety threat?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a good question. And sometimes these are difficult, right? Because at the end of the day, parents have a right to choose also what type of care they get for their children. And so we would need to have a lot of information, collateral information from medical providers, from and have an understanding of why speech therapy is necessary, to really understand if this is becoming a threat. Typically on these cases, parents usually will engage and they'll see the benefit of working with speech therapists, but really for it to be a threat, we'd need to know that there's going to be a severe consequence to this child. So the speech therapy will lead to them not being able to communicate at all or in school, or be able to, it's going to impact that, have a severe impact to the long-term consequences of this child. And then it would probably move to a safety threat there. Or if there was any other circumstances, again, I think I said this earlier too, like if the parents were struggling with substance abuse or significant untreated mental health, and they couldn't control their behaviors, which is another piece of what the threshold is, then it could move into a safety threat in that situation too. Fortunately, this is a great example of usually when we can go out and really case plan with families and support them to get to understand the importance of those appointments, and then they engage. So typically this doesn't run into a threat, but those would be the things that I think. I don't know, Jennifer, if you have anything else to add.
No, I agree with everything that you just said. I mean, typically we try to do as many supports as possible to family, get their family, their friends involved, to try to support them and help them make the appointments. We'd have to have some other factors involved for it to become a threat. Definitely in medical, saying that this is going to have lifelong consequences possibly.
And I want to cover this from the legal perspective, because the discussion about whether something is a risk or threat, especially in the lens of 1227, is about the authority of the court to remove a child. And the reason that's important to distinguish is it's completely differentiable from the department and the court's authority to find the child dependent and to order certain things. And so the fact that even if they're missing these appointments with supports might not be a basis for the removal of the child from the home, but arguably it's a basis for a C dependency, that there's the child has no parent who's capable of caring for them, such that they be subject to physiological or psychological damage. And so certainly the court, if they made those findings, could make a finding of a C dependency and then not order an out-of-home placement, order the department to make sure that the child was being transported or to help with that. I think then there's questions about what the law, or if the law is, if it continues to be an issue, and what the remedy is. I guess I would amend the hypothetical a little bit. If after months, if not coming up on years of case planning in the family with a dependent child, if the only issue was not getting the child to speech therapy, there'd probably be other issues going along with it that would be discovered by that point, if we toy around with the hypothetical a little bit. But what's, I think, incredibly important is not removing the child doesn't mean that there doesn't need to be court involvement, court orders, filing of dependency, a finding of dependency. It doesn't preclude any of those things. It just means that, hey, maybe this child doesn't need to be removed while we're trying to solve those problems. Moving on to the last hypothetical we have. It's substance use with an older child. We're going to say 15-year-old child. The parent is really using substances to a point of becoming significantly inebriated or passing out, falling asleep, not leading to any abuse or anything like that, but they are significantly using substances to the point that it impacts their ability to function on their own behalf, let alone their child's. Is this a risk or a threat? 15-year-old child.
All right, so another 5 seconds here. 4, 3, 2, and 1.
All right, an even 3/4 split, 75% risk, 25% threat. So right there in the middle. Dee and Jennifer, thoughts on whether this is crossing the threshold of risk or threat?
Yeah, so, Jennifer, did you want to go first?
Oh, go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, so with a 15-year-old child, there's some ability to self-protect. So when you're looking at vulnerability of that child and how it impacts that child, it probably presents as a risk. I mean, again, we need a lot more information to gather, but we also, when parents are abusing substances, we also have to have a correlation to how it impacts child safety. So if the parent is abusing substances and unable to control their behavior, and then they are engaging in physical confrontation or actions with the youth that leads to an injury, that might tip it into a threat. But as it stands, a parent abusing substances with a 15-year-old who has the ability to self-protect, if they don't have any special needs or are able, or any developmental delays or anything, then this would present as a risk. Again, all of these scenarios are so hard for the department because we are gatherers of information and we're curious and we need to know more before we can decide if something's a risk or a threat. We want to work with parents to understand kind of the full picture of what's going on for them and what's happening. And so, yeah, these questions are always so hard to answer because it's like, I need more information, but just at base level, I would say that this is a risk.
Well, I love that answer, Dee, because that means the hypothetical is designed exactly the way it's supposed to be, because it's supposed to be a hard question and right on that line. Jennifer?
I was just going to say, I mean, what else is this child able to do? Are they able to go to a neighbor's house or grandma's house when mom's or dad is using? Are they able to get themselves to school? Are they able to have their own food at home that they're able to prepare themselves, even though the parent is using? Or those are things also we'd be looking at. How is this child able to still take care of themselves and self-protect?
Yeah, so I think everybody was right onto it and goes to those two things using the department's 5 criteria, the 4 with the ABA. It's specific. We know what the parent is doing. It's immediate. It's happening this second. It's out of control. The parent is not having control over what's going on. But then it raises the question, is there severe consequences? Well, if the child's 15 and, I think it was brought up, if they had maybe other special needs or their needs weren't being met, it would be a different story. But they could, if this is happening at night and the child's able to make sure that they're fed and taken care of, that could be there. And same thing with vulnerability of the child, unless there's any special circumstances. We talked a little bit about it, but how would this push over into becoming a safety threat with what the hypothetical is right now? Dee or Jennifer?
Well, I kind of alluded to some of that, right? If the parent's behavior is out of control to a degree that they are impacting their child's safety, let's say this child has some sort of a need, like this child is actively suicidal and struggling with mental health, and the parent isn't allowing them to access services or support because of their inability to maintain sobriety or because of their fear. If it's impacting a child's, if a child has any special needs or any specific needs and the parent's substance use struggles are impacting them to support their child. Or again, I think another one, when I think about 15-year-olds in this situation, a lot of the intakes that we see are a parent that's under the influence and then gets into physical altercations with their teen kids, and then their teen kids get hurt, sometimes very severely hurt, broken arms, significant bruising. Like, that's when we'd be really looking at a safety threat and how we would need to plan around that.
All right, well, that's what we have for the hypotheticals, and I just want to highlight, what it comes down to and what's looked at in terms of there being a threat, and that specifically these were attempted to be designed to show you that you could have several of these factors that go into a determination of an imminent threat, but without all of them, you're not quite there, and it's something that's a risk. It's something that can and should be addressed. It's something that can be discussed and case planned. Even be a basis for a finding of dependency, but it's not without those 4 or 5 things, that it's specific, that it's immediate, that it's out of control, and that there's severe consequences, and then looking also in the lens of the vulnerability of the child. Without those things, you're not at the point that it's a threat, and it's something that can have court orders around it, but ultimately shouldn't result in the removal of the child from the family. And key talking, because we're here to talk about safety planning, is when it comes to safety planning, you have to determine what those threats are. Because if the threat is physical abuse, and we go, great, we're going to send you to a drug and alcohol evaluator, and has nothing to do with it, you're not addressing that. That safety plan isn't addressing what the actual issue is and what's leading to that safety threat. And so key to understand that. I want to move on, and then I'll turn it over to Taila, but talk about prevention services. And this is critical with 1227, because what 1227 provides is that, first off, if there's a finding that there's an imminent risk of imminent physical harm, and the court makes that finding, there's still the question about whether participation in prevention services can prevent that need for removal. And if the parent does agree to engage in prevention services that would mitigate that imminent physical harm, the court has to place the child with the parent, obviously under those means of prevention services. Now, this is something that might come back to haunt me as a parent's attorney, but my position here today is that safety planning is part of prevention services, and saying that, okay, well, if the parent agrees to X, Y, and Z, and we could put those in place, that's a basis not to remove the child, and the court shall put the place with the child with that prevention service, which is safety planning, in place as those conditions. Because the statute's not quite clear. It says that engagement in prevention services means that there can't be the removal, but it doesn't specifically say with conditions. So it's my position that those conditions can be ordered by the court as those prevention services is put in the statute. And I think what's important to note here, we can go over this in more detail if we have time to fill up, is that prevention services is specifically defined. It's defined under 1334.030, which is the definitions part of the dependency statutes. And I think something other also to note is that prevention services includes housing assistance. And that part, housing assistance, also defined by that statute, specifically includes financial subsidies or other monetary assistance for housing, which gives the court authority to order financial subsidies and other monetary assistance for housing as a prevention service. Is specifically being unhoused is a issue that is leading to imminent physical harm. And there's talk in there about what's called family preservation services. And family preservation services are also defined in statute. You can go down the rabbit hole of references to these statutes, but I do want to cover one portion and hopefully get a survey answer, because we did this last time. And one of these definitions of prevention services, preservation services, is intensive family preservation services. And it has these factors, or these things by a statutory definition. It has Service providers deliver the service in the family's home, other environments such as neighborhoods and schools. Caseload size averages 2 families per service provider. So only 2 families per person. And unless they utilize paraprofessionals, and in that case, still no more than 5 families, that the service is provided by a single service provider, and that the service is available within 24 hours following the receipt of the service. And then that can be no more than 40 days. So I guess my question is, I'm curious, how many feel that in their jurisdiction, they have a service that's available within 24 hours, where the provider has no more than 2 people that they're working with, and they're only working with a single person who's going in the home and neighborhood and school? Who feels that they do have this service, or who feels that they have not seen this service in their jurisdiction? Yes would be yes, you feel like you've seen that service, that available within 24 hours, a single person, that person is working with no more than 2 families, available for 40 days, and going in the home. Yes or no?
Okay, 5 more seconds. 3, 2, and 1.
All right. 100% no. Well, all right, not much to say about that. So like I said, that's a statute, that's a preservation service, which is a prevention service. It's defined by statute. You know, I'll tell you, I had this in a case the other day, and I said, hey, can we get that service? And they go, oh, it's not available until August 14th. It's like, okay, well, that's not really meeting that it's helping the family immediately. And so I think worth noting that these things are defined by statute. They're worth looking at. They exist out there. Question about whether they're available or not, or whether they're meeting the needs or not. But there's a lot of stuff out there about what can happen and what can help a family, and not just stuff that you're guessing about. Things that are defined explicitly by statute, all worth looking at. And so with that, I'll move on to Taila to go on to actually talk about safety planning.
So as Adam mentioned when we first started, what F.I.R.S.T Clinic is a prevention service that serves families that are either pregnant or have recently given birth and are at risk of department intervention and potential removal of their child. And our goal is to prevent that from occurring, and working in collaboration with the department to try and our clients' natural and community supports to do what we can to prevent the removal of a child and ultimately the filing of a dependency petition. When I first started doing parents' representation work in 2009, when our office would receive a petition that had allegations stating that a parent had used substances while pregnant and then gave birth to a child that had been exposed to substances in utero and was experiencing signs of withdrawal. In our situation, that was an automatic removal. We knew what that shelter care, we were going to show up and we were going to be met with a parent who was experiencing extreme trauma, extreme fear. They had just gone through a meeting with the department in which they had been asked, where would you want your child placed? And they had oftentimes done that meeting alone. They had no idea what was happening. Their reactions varied anywhere from anger to complete shutdown, to denial. And so for me, those hearings or those meetings and those hearings were the worst. And we would come into these cases and we would ask our clients, if you had the opportunity to go to a 6-month inpatient program where you could take your baby, would you do that? And our clients would say yes. Or we would start to question, do you have supports that are available that could help you keep your child, that could stay with you, or could help you keep your child in home? And sometimes we would have clients that would say yes, but oftentimes we would have clients that would say no, they had nobody to rely on. And in addition to doing the state contracted work that we would do, our office also represented private clients. We would get contacted by families that had the means and privilege to hire attorneys prior to CPS intervention or during that meeting. And so we would be able to step in and come in before a dependency petition had been filed. And we would meet with that family and we would come up with a plan, a safety plan that we would then present to the department at that meeting. And we would gather all of our clients, natural supports, everyone available. And then we would ask the department, if grandma moves in with mom for 30 days, would baby be able to be discharged from the hospital? If mom moves in with grandma, if we create a network of people that are going in and checking on this family, would that be something that would allow this child to stay in home? And almost always we would be successful in keeping those children with their families. And it was really through that inequity that the first clinic was born. We felt that this was not something that should be afforded only to families that could hire an attorney to represent them, but to all families. And so when we're working with families through the first clinic, risk exists. We're working with parents who specifically are at risk for CPS intervention. And our goal is to work with parents as far extreme as possible. So when they're early on in their pregnancy, but a lot of times we get our clients when they're at the hospital, right after the child has been born. Oh, I see Lois. And so when we're working with these parents, there is almost always risk. And prior to having a deeper understanding of the department safety framework, a lot of these can turn into threats very quickly. And so our goal with the clinic was to come up with ways that we could work with clients who didn't necessarily have natural supports. Like Adam said, over a third of our clients have experience with the foster care system themselves as children. Their families don't always necessarily qualify to be able to pass background checks. They don't have family that they can rely on. And so what we do, and Jennifer and Gina are going to talk a lot more about how their role in this, which is huge, is we start to work with our clients either prior to CPS involvement or before that initial FTDM meeting, and really start to build a support network. Who do our clients have that are natural supports that can help step in and alleviate some of these potential risks and threats that exist? If they don't have natural supports, who can we pull from the community or other professionals that can step in and take that place? And so in order, like Neil said, in order to address any type of threat, or in order to be able to safety plan, you have to be able to identify what is the risk, what is going on. And with our work with the department, specifically in Snohomish County, we're currently working across the state, but Snohomish County is our home. That is where the clinic was born. That is just where we practice. And so we're very familiar with the services in Snohomish County, but we're also very familiar with the department in Snohomish County. And so there's a lot of trust and understanding there. And in Snohomish County, I believe that we've been able to work together with the department to step outside of the box and to really get creative when looking at these families and trying to determine ways that we could keep these extremely vulnerable children in home. And so I have reached out to, Dee and I reached out during our last presentation to get some examples from around the county of things that we've done, First Clinic has done with the department to be able to ensure that children can stay safely within the home. And so we had a mother who was going to a PPW bed. So she was going to a 6-month inpatient program in which she would be able to keep her child. However, she did not have her discharge date from the hospital. Hers and baby's was 10 days prior to her being able to enter that program. And so there was a 10-day stretch in which we had a mother who was very, very new to her recovery and a brand new baby that needed a place to go. And this mother did not have any types of natural supports that she could rely on in order to keep that baby in her home. And so what we were able to do is work with community members that were able and willing to step up and be part of a 24-hour safety plan. And at first, there was a little bit of resistance from the department, only because that was something completely new. The department had never worked with people who were essentially strangers to a family, who were part of a safety plan. But then I think that they stepped back, thought about it, and thought, why not? And Dee, I'll let you talk a little bit about that, because I know that was your office.
Yeah, I mean, I think that with the shift in legislation and with doing what's right for families in these situations, you really have to step back and look at a bigger picture. And I think one of the reasons that that's really important to be creative is that Taila kind of mentioned this. Our families come to the table with different resources, and that's really where a lot of disproportionality can happen. And so us getting very creative with families that have minimal resources is very important, and it's very impactful to our families, and it impacts disproportionality, because most of the families that have a lack of resources are BIPOC families. And so we do step back and we think about this, and there was a way to look at a community provider or person. I believe this was a nurse in the community that was willing to support the family and could do a background check and was more than willing to engage themselves in this process. And it really created the idea of how do we do this more often? How do we pull other people to the table that might know this family or that don't know this family, but also might be willing to help? And so, yeah, we just got really creative around that. We could still apply all of the department policy around how do we assess a safety plan participant and utilize this person, and it worked. And so that felt like success for the family. And the other thing I just want to mention that I think is really important in our work in the work with F.I.R.S.T Clinic is that it's such a gift to the families to come to those initial meetings, having a parent with lived experience, which Gina and Jennifer have shared that they do have lived experience, and an attorney, because the power imbalance at that initial meeting is so significant, and something that has always been something that was just hard for me and hard for a lot of our staff. It's like, how do we create something that feels different? And so I love that, especially since I'm not in Snohomish anymore, I love that Legal F.I.R.S.T Clinic is, trying to work across the state. But again, just that gift to parents is so significant, and creates change in how we work with parents and their willingness to work with us. And even when there's disagreements around particulars of safety planning between the department and F.I.R.S.T Clinic, just the fact that we're working collaboratively like demonstrates and role models that to the parents, so the parents feel more comfortable working with the department too. And so it's pretty special. And again, I think creative safety planning is so important in order to put services in place to mitigate any safety concerns, as well as making sure that we're not moving forward with removal that's unnecessary.
Excellent, Dee. Thank you. And I mean, in reality, we couldn't do this without the department's support and help. And so we're really grateful that we have an open-minded, creative department in Snohomish County. And I think that with this shift in 1227, we're going to start to see that ripple across the state. And so know that this is something that has been happening prior to 1227. Snohomish County's been doing this since 2019, and it has been successful. We've seen a substantial drop in filings with all children across the board. And I believe that is because the department, as Dee likes to say, got comfortable with being uncomfortable. And when you're taking the most vulnerable children, brand new newborn infants, from the hospital, and you are allowing them to stay home with their family, you start to look at other cases differently. If we can do this with a newborn baby, why aren't we doing this with a 7-year-old? Why aren't we doing this with this 10-year-old? And so that brings me to another example in which we had an older child who his father was considered safe. There was no risk regard to him. His mother was in very active with substance use disorder, and so there was potential threat there. There was risk, and so he needed a place to go after school. until his father got home and could supervise him with his mother. And so they, with the help of the department, they were able to work with the school employee who was the bus driver, who would allow the child to ride with her to the end of her route before taking the child home, so that then that child would have less time to have to be alone with his mother. And then a neighbor would come and be able to step in because she would have gotten work off that time until dad got home. And so that was an extremely way of thinking outside of the box and using resources that existed to this family and allowed this child to safely stay in the home. And so before I cover all of my examples, I'm going to just turn this directly over to Gina and Jennifer and be able to talk about what this looks like in real life, how they're able to come up with these supports when they're working with these families, and then what this does for a family when you are able to allow a child to stay in home. So Gina, thank you.
Thank you, Taila. Oh, you guys took my example, and it's because it's such a special one. And, you know, I just want to piggyback off of that. One of the evening person was a retired nurse, and the other person that was during the evening was a woman in our community that had a son that had passed away that wanted to give back to the community and families in need. So that was really creative. And I remember thinking and being in that meeting thinking, okay, this is somebody that I really don't even know either, but is coming from a trusted community partner with the embedded social worker program. And I trust her. So I trusted the situation, but I was thinking, I don't know her. Then I was thinking, well, children go into foster care and they don't know them. So this is going to be okay. So just wanted to share a little bit about that. So I introduced myself earlier as the parent ally with the F.I.R.S.T Legal Clinic, and never did I imagine in 54 years that my past with my 27 lived experience of DV and an 11-year drug addiction would really be a strength for the mothers that I get to work with today. That is first and foremost the most important thing in my work, and part of safety plannings and building trust. Sharing some of my experience, strength, and hope with these mothers is that probably the first time in a long time, or maybe ever for some of these mothers, that they've actually felt heard and seen and connecting with somebody that comes from experiences that they've endured in themselves. And so for me, that is the first thing that is so important in safety plan building, because I've built that trust with the mothers. Every safety plan is different, and it depends on the mother's needs or the family's needs, because we do work with fathers as well. And so, sorry, I just went back because I'm sitting here speaking truth and sharing vulnerability. And so thank you. So basically with safety plan building, I think for me is the most important piece is creating a plan that the mom is going to be comfortable with, and that she connects with the providers in the community that are going to be a part of that plan. And so there's different programs in the community, and there's different places to go to get the supports that every mother needs. So oftentimes there is that, you know, coverage in between treatment where we have to utilize hotels and get really creative and reach out to community supports that are going to be able to check in either in person or even FaceTime or Messenger on the phone. So creating plans so there's eyes on the family during the most vulnerable time. So we have used hotels, we've used other parent allies in our community. We work really closely with the different PCAP programs across the state of Washington. And that is a nice program because that's ongoing. And so it's 3 years. So these moms are establishing that relationship with that mother at the beginning and the mother with the caseworker. And man, it is just truly been just seeing the difference in these safety plans and these moms staying together and having the supports that are built around them from the beginning, how they're growing together within the bond of their child and the community supports that they have. Getting them into PPW programs has been really amazing too, and seeing their growth as they leave and they're never separated. Because being in this line of work for so long and seeing moms being separated at birth and coming back through their trauma and re-engaging the bond with their baby is a struggle. And there's all the guilt and shame that comes with that. And these moms are not having to deal with that. They're growing together. They're growing together in their new lifestyle together. And I guess I want to just share really about a really special safety plan and a really amazing story, and one that I'm honored to be a part of. I met with a mother over the phone that was in Pierce County. And I talked to her. I shared a little bit about my experience and created that trusted space that I was talking about. And, you know, it's really important too with working with the attorneys and that warm handoff. And, you know, I remember this one so just like it was 5 minutes ago with Adam and the phone call and just, you know, making that connection. And I made a connection of real familiar space for me personally, in my past and my trauma with being involved in the child welfare system with my own children. And there was that connection and that safe space that was in that very first phone call. I offered, mom was due, she was gonna have the baby in about 30 days, and she was in Pierce County, I'm in Snohomish, and I know I can help, but I just can't help at the level that I can right here in my community. Because of the supports and the relationships that I have. And so I told her, you know, would you be willing to come to Snohomish County? And, you know, I could wrap more services around you to help you get the outcome that you're looking for. And at the very end, I could tell I wasn't hooking, she wasn't coming. I could just feel that energy. And I knew I needed to offer one more thing before she hung up, and that was a hotel. I said, if you could get in your car right now and come up here, if I put you in a hotel, is that something you would do? Nope. And it was like, okay. And I remember hanging up the phone, and I remember feeling, I get it, I've been there, right? And it's hard to trust. It's hard to leave your familiar surroundings, even though it's not healthy for you. And I just went back to that place in my own journey. And we hung up, and I was just like, okay, her journey's her journey. And if she reaches out, I'm going to show up. She called back, and she said yes. And I remember just that sense of freedom, because I know what I can do when a mother is willing to engage in services. And so she said yes. And I said, okay, let me call you back. I called, I got her a hotel room. I called her back. I told her what hotel room it was, everything where she needed to be, and the rest was on her. And she came. And she didn't come that day, it was like a day later, but she did come. And when she got here to Snohomish County, I had everything set up for her that she needed to be wrapped around to have the outcome that she was looking for with her child. And she had an embedded social worker through the Snohomish County Sheriff's Program that was constantly communicating with her and making sure that she had food and all of her needs. I remember having to help her get an ID, because we need all that stuff for the next level that she's moving towards. I had her have an intake with her PCAP worker, and so she was able to start that right away. And then, you know, more came with that: school, you know, car, all the things that she needed to continue on her journey. But really the focus here is on that safety plan and her having the services that she needed to have to grow and come from a place that she was stuck in, which was fear. that the department was going to take her baby when her baby was born. And she had everything that she needed because during this process, she was empowered, she was supported, and she was a part of her plan. And so she got to bring a provider, I can't remember his name, but I have it in my notes, from Pierce County that she had been working with. So she had, when we went into this FTDM, she had her attorney, she had different people that she had been working with, all surrounding her, including her family that was, you know, there through her trials and tribulations of difficulty in trauma that was instilled in her with the department from her past. And these safety plans work. And it's an honor to work with these moms and put them all together because they're all different and individual. But those relationships that are built from the very beginning, from the parent ally role, is that trusted space from the lived experience, one mother sharing to another mother that experience and that connection. And so I'm going to turn it over to the amazing mom that I was just talking about, Jennifer Justice.
Thank you, Gina. First time you started speaking, my eyes started welling up with my tears. Gina's right. That my first phone call with Gina made the difference. The fact that she understood where I was and understood the language I was using and my trauma. And so safety plans changed my life. They saved my relationship with my children and gave me a second chance at being a mom. And that wasn't always my story. In 2018, when I was, or I'm sorry, 2015, when I was delivered with my 8-year-old, when the department stepped into my life, their form of a safety plan was to remove my son. That was the first and only option discussed. Their idea of a safety plan was to keep my son safe from me. And although I'm grateful for my family stepping in, that did not help me because they wanted me to connect with services, but I didn't have a car. I didn't have a phone. I didn't have a home. I had lost all my belongings, and now new trauma was put into my life. And so I was in a space where I couldn't get better, even if I wanted to. And on top of that, gas vouchers weren't offered, bus passes weren't offered. I just didn't have the right support and services, or services were offered, but not the right supports, or even the way to connect to those services properly to be able to be successful in a safety plan, alone from the fact that the safety plan was really designed to keep me and my son apart. And that was really difficult for me because I had been a mother to 2 children prior to that where I was not an addict. So I had brought my babies home and I had loved them and I had that special connection with them that, you know, and if any of you are moms of boys, you'll know there's just this special connection between a mom and her son that unfortunately I do not have with my 8-year-old today because of that. And that is something that I struggle with even to this day. I love him. He knows me as his mom, but having that removal and not the chance to parent my child, whether I was ready or not, I'll never know because I was never given the opportunity. And then so to fast forward to the example that Gina is talking about where a safety plan was made and I was able to keep my son, and the plan from the beginning was no matter how difficult this is, we're going to keep your son with you and give you the opportunity. And my safety plan included my parents having, or my family having to come to Snohomish County and do a 1-person check on my family with me every day. My parents lived in Ording and in Covington. And so they were driving sometimes 2 hours each way to just do a 20-minute check on me, which they did, and it worked. And I was in a hotel where I felt safe and I had the supports, and Gina put in ongoing supports for me to where I could be successful long-term, long after she was gone. And so I did family voluntary services and everything did work out for me. Vanessa Fines with my family voluntary service worker, and I always want to give her a shout out when I do because she was just so wonderful. But even with the safety plan, you know, not having even the same social worker and the same attorney for very long, I had so many in my 2015 case that I couldn't tell you how many or even their names. Was really, really difficult for me. And so, you know, having that consistency, having that respect, Gina was the first person in my life to show me what it was to show up for somebody, to answer a phone call when she said, to connect me to a service and not just hand me a telephone number. There was a name, there was a time, and somebody picked up on the other end. And if they didn't, she made sure that that connection was made through a warm handoff. And those things were critical for me, who had been let down so severely in the past and not having trust anyways. And when the department does step into your life, whether they mean to or not, they create trauma, and they create doubt in yourself as a mother and as a woman and as a person. And that is very difficult to come back from. And so having this support and having this plan was great for me. And now to be able to come full circle and to have, like Gina said, my trauma have purpose today means so much to me, because I get to work with other moms and I get to show up and say the same things that Gina said to me. I am going to be here and be here. I'm going to help you. And if I don't know the services in your community, really connect to them. And getting creative has been crucial in that. I'm grateful for the position that I have, because I can get really creative, and I've had to use methadone clinics as part of safety plans, where they're going to check in even on days when they're not being dosed or they're not. I've had them be participants. I've reached out to the community for a mom who left treatment unexpectedly and still really wanted to participate and make sure things went well. And so we got her into a hotel and she went on. But we come across these things where, even simple things like gas vouchers can be just so crucial to a safety plan being really amazing, really successful. But there is always that need for more, right? We do need better resources to housing, and housing is always going to be a barrier. But I've utilized friends and families, neighbors, and I think that it is really important for an apartment to be open-minded, because when people feel like their hands are tied, it just makes mom feel that way, that there's just no hope. There's a bunch of no's instead of a bunch of ways of different avenues and different doors. And I think it's just safety plans. Ultimately, the safety plan that was presented to me and my family, it set me on a path for success. And I think that it's so important for everybody to be able to get creative and to see that not everybody has family like I did, or even friends like I did. And so to be able to utilize other safety plan participants, whether it be doctors, SUDP workers, community partners. I also had somebody, my family has wanted to give back multiple times for the help that the F.I.R.S.T clinic gave to me. But I really do rely on the F.I.R.S.T clinic for a lot of my safety plans, whether that be, funding for transportation or for things like that. And so I'm just very, very grateful. And I'm very grateful to see how 1227 coming into effect. And although it's early and there's going to be many speed bumps, I see that change, it's gonna be life altering to so many people, to so many mothers who, so many parents who just want a second chance or a first chance, and just need the right support, need people to show up. And I think that is, like Gina said, having that trust takes a long time for some people. And we're talking about people needing to trust us in minutes and moments and a day. And that's really difficult, but these safety plans have made it possible. And so thank you guys for letting me share.
Thank you, Jennifer. We love you. I want to just quickly, we don't have a lot of time, so I want to leave time for questions. I think that if you are part of the court right now, you might be asking, how can we use safety plans as a judicial officer? And our thought is that safety planning is a prevention services. And so the court can use safety plans to keep children in the home, pre-dependency fact-finding. And something that was mentioned several times by Dee and Jennifer and Gina is that there's disproportionality in the child welfare system and the criminal justice system. And under DCYF policy, that can disqualify a lot of people from being part of a safety plan. And so clients that are disproportionately impacted as children, who have been a part of the system, they often lack support. Families that come from marginalized communities who don't have the opportunity to build wealth like some other families have, that don't have the same flexibility with resources and time, they're going to be at a disadvantage. And so the court, as well as the department, should be looking at ways to make accommodations from an equitable level for these families, understanding that it might not look perfect, and that if families don't have the supports necessary to create safety plans, it is the department's job to fill those gaps. A family should not be punished for coming from a marginalized group. And so I think that something that can be taken back to your own communities is really challenging the department and the families to get creative. What can we do to help these families and to fill these gaps? And then with that, I'm going to turn it over to Neil very quickly to cover his reasonable efforts.
Well, thank you, Taila, and I'll do this quickly. So the first thing I want to focus on, reasonable efforts is a requirement by statute that the department or filing party has made reasonable efforts to prevent or eliminate the need for removal. And I'll say one of my frustrations is how courts sometimes interpret this, despite I think the statute being crystal clear that that's a requirement for out-of-home placement. A Supreme Court case that explicitly says that there is no exception to the reasonable efforts requirement. Despite all that and the changes of 1227, I'm still seeing decisions from the court that says reasonable efforts is not a necessary finding because, for example, that there's a statute that says the child's safety and welfare, health, safety, and welfare is paramount. And interpretations from courts, despite cases that say otherwise and statutes that say otherwise, that somehow overrides that requirement for reasonable effort. So there still is that important factor under state law for reasonable efforts. And it's important to differentiate remedial and preventative services and reasonable efforts versus investigation services. Services that are offered to actually help or prevent and eliminate the need for removal versus something that's doing an evaluation like a UA or a psychological evaluation or something that's going to take quite a bit of time and really is just providing information and not actually preventing or eliminating the imminent physical threat. But the bottom line is for reasonable efforts is that when the cases actually go to court, there's only one party that's in a position that they can provide help and the court has any authority over that, and that's the department. And reasonable efforts is the tool to get them to provide that help. And something that we've learned and has been discussed about with F.I.R.S.T, and not to toot our own horn too much, is that things and options are out there. And we started in 2019. We started in 2019 with Parent Ally and some attorneys and zero funding. And we eventually were able to get funding. We still have far less than $1 million a year, far less than $500,000 a year that funds us. And what have we been able to accomplish? Well, we work with community sources that already exist and get them to help our clients. We have, for example, PCAP that helps with in-home services and concrete supports, and they participate in safety plans. We work with embedded social workers and law enforcement who get access to treatment beds and detox in our diversion center and hotel vouchers. We work with a program in Snohomish County called Homeward House, who helps with in-home services, concrete supports, participation in safety plans, providing parent allies, parenting classes. We work with treatment providers who have helped access assessments over Zoom, do assessments while our clients are still in the hospital after giving birth, participate in meetings with the department. We work with medical assistance, MOUD treatment programs for methadone or Suboxone. We work with religious organizations who provide things like food, concrete goods, doctors and nursing staff, other attorneys to help with other legal areas that are outside of CPS, doulas and midwives, mental health providers, perinatal support services, Child Strive Wonderland, Within Reach, Hope Rising, all of these partners that we have that work with directly with our clients within hours, days of us finding these clients. And the bottom line is that DCYF is capable of so much more. If we can do that with a parent ally and a handful of attorneys and zero funding, what is the department capable of with literally billions of dollars and many employees? And the court is the ultimate arbiter on what reason is reasonable and what is not. And so I would propose that some of these following things are reasonable. Offering a family housing when they're unhoused is reasonable. Finding family members to assist with a family is reasonable. Solving barriers a family has is reasonable. Offering childcare is reasonable. Offering transportation is reasonable. Not just maybe bus tickets, actual transportation. Reaching out to the community and finding people like Gina talked about is reasonable. Offering gas and money for concrete goods is reasonable. In certain circumstances, offering a doula or a night nurse is reasonable. I would propose that if we can figure those things out with our limited resources, those things in the court ordering them are reasonable. I'll also say some things that I don't think are reasonable. The department just simply saying that they don't have the time to locate a service. That's not reasonable by itself. That they don't have the money, not reasonable without more information. That they're not contracted with somebody. That's not reasonable unless they have information about the attempts that are made. Or not having enough providers, also not reasonable without more information about the attempts that are made. There's a case out there, which isn't for the department, it's for a Department of Corrections, called Our Lady of Lourdes Hospital versus Franklin County. It cites 120 Win 2D 439. And what that talks about is that DOC was supposed to provide medical care for people who were incarcerated. And they said, well, we don't have the money or the resources to do it. And the court said, that's not good enough. You have to actually provide proof of that. And for all of these same reasons, if the department comes in and says, we can't do that, we don't have the people, we don't have the resources, we don't have it. No, come in and prove it. Prove who you tried to contact to set up contracts. Prove that you've tried to reach out to every or many of the medical or counselors that are in a county and see if they could help out with counseling. And as well, and that's not something I think that is the responsibility of a line caseworker. It's a responsibility of the department as a really big entity, but they need to show those things. And so the court really decides what's reasonable. The final comment that I'm going to make is that I think parental autonomy is incredibly important to consider. There's a case now, it's for now the now defunct non-parental custody statutes, but it's in re SM, which is 9 Win App 2D 325. And what it talks about is placement out of home or out of with a parent isn't just about custody and where a child's placed. Placement is about the care, custody, and control of the child and the constitutional rights of a parent. And we all know situations where people are unavailable and there's no filing of a dependency, there's no guardianship because the parents just figure it out. A parent's in the military and they go overseas. A parent is sick and they go to the hospital. A parent works in Alaska because they're fishing there. And we don't file dependencies on those cases. And so if a parent is struggling with something like substance use or mental health disorder, but they're able to figure out things like, hey, my kids are going to go stay with their grandmother for a little while. Does the court really need to come in and interrupt that parental autonomy? If their parental decision-making is good, just because the children don't physically live with them? And so I think that's also something worth bringing up when it comes to application of these statutes too.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of the we do have a lot of resources that we provide to family. One of the resources that I think that is always tricky is housing, is, you know, how we support with that, because we don't have funds and always available for that, and that's hard. But we do have gas vouchers. We help people with groceries. We help families fix their cars. We help, you know, we also engage in active efforts, because like I have always worked in a ICWA office where we're actually going out into the community and driving parents to their supports. We're asking about more in-depth questions about their trauma and how it would impact them to receive services in certain places. We're really taking extra time to like really engage families and support them in all the ways we can. I do think when Neil was very passionate at the end talking about how to push back on the department and what they had, and I like that he, in one line of what he said is, social workers don't make the decisions on our contracts. That's not something a line worker is able to manipulate, go out and find. And so pushing back on a social worker to like accomplish things that the department or the agency doesn't have access to presents challenges and makes it difficult for social workers that are just really trying to do good work with families. And so we do have a ton of resources that we can offer. Again, with both concrete funds, with Gosh, we've even gone out and helped with fixing refrigerators, washers, dryers. So we do have access to a lot of resources where we can immediately help families. And we do have a lot of evidence-based practice services that we can afford families. And some of our communities, our individual counties are more rich with community resources. Snohomish has a lot of excellent community resources. Something that moving to Whatcom County don't have as many, and that's hard. That feels different, right, in county to county. So sometimes the department has to look within themselves when there's not enough community resources, and that can be a challenge. But what I would say is our agency has been very open to listening about some of the resources that we don't have and how we can get those. They're working diligently on getting contracts. Those take time. They're not easy. They're working on looking at how to pay. How to pay contracts higher, right? Because sometimes we have good contracts, but what we used to pay them doesn't work now. And the agency is working really hard on that. And Jennifer maybe could speak more to this too, but we've hired a lot of people to really talk about and address service array. Each of our regions now will have somebody that is helping to go out and find contracts in communities where maybe there's less supports. And I do agree with Neil that if we're saying we don't have a service available, we should explain our efforts to find that service. But I will say that there will be times when we can't. Some of our best services, we have a lot of families in need. And the fentanyl crisis, which we didn't talk about this time, and we talked a little bit about last time, is pretty significant and scary. And there's a lot of children ingesting fentanyl. And so we are using those high dollar resources to really support those families to keep kids in homes. And so we don't have enough of those sometimes. And so that is the reality. But again, our agency is continuing to work on that and expand. And I feel hopeful about that moving forward. I hope that helps.
Thank you, Dee. I agree also. Having recently come from the field to headquarters, I am seeing a lot. I'm involved in a lot of the higher level meetings about developing services and contracts and things like that. And it does take time, but I know there's a lot of effort being put into that right now because we do need more services and more supports. I came from an area where I was an area administrator of a small office and a larger office. And definitely seeing my larger office had a lot more resources and the smaller office had to get really creative when working with families. It definitely makes a difference. So really focusing a lot on some of those rural communities as well, where we had to get creative in some of the services and supports to families. As far as housing resources, I see that question in the chat. There is at headquarters also working on how do we provide some sort of housing support because we don't have that funding right now. I know in working in the local office, we would work with our local agencies of trying to get them into housing. If there's wait lists, if there's small gaps, could we pay for hotel for a short amount of time? That can't be an indefinite solution to pay for hotel, but if it's a gap that we can do, absolutely, that's something we should be looking into. But it can't be for a year of hotel because it's just not, the funding isn't there for that and it's not reasonable. But we are definitely being more creative. And I like that, as we should be working with families and trying to keep them together and provide services and support. So I think you have a lot of people at the department who are also really excited about 1227 and how we can really change our practice and support families.